everyone, welcome. This is Izzy at Minerva. In today's video we're going to be looking at how to create a drawstring waistband. Now this is one that is incredibly useful. You see it on lots of kind of loose fitting garments where you just want to like tie in the waist a little bit more to give you a little bit of shape. In this video we're going to be using our standard skirt block which we've drafted in previous videos. However, you may well want to use your trouser block or even apply this method to your dress. In order to follow along with this video, you're going to need your standard pattern drafting kit, and that's listed next to me here. We do recommend for this one that you have some interfacing, simply because we'd like to reinforce the point where the drawstring is going to come out through the garment, because that bit has a lot of tension. So for you, if you're doing your final version, I would recommend using interfacing at that point. In front of me here, we've got our standard skirt block with our front and our skirt back. As I've said, you may want to have your trouser block in front of you, but the sort of techniques that we're going to be looking at along the waist for the waistline will be the same for both. So to start off with, I want you to grab your pattern drafting ruler. Then I want you to draw a straight line up from the side seam on your pattern piece. Do the same for the skirt front or trouser front. Next, I want you to draw a perpendicular line from the centre back out to that new line you just created. And do the same for the skirt front. From the centre front, draw a straight line out to that new side seam you just created. At this point, you can see that the skirt is still going to fit us because the width of the hip remains the same, so we can pull the skirt up over our hips, but we've just got a bit more volume up at the waist. We're also going to ignore the darts on the pieces, so that gives us extra volume along the waist, which our drawstring will then pull in and clinch into our waist as we create this skirt. The next thing we want to do to these two pieces is to create the casing. So for me, I'm going to do a 3 centimetre deep casing. You may well want to do a different depth, but you can follow me along with this if you want. So I'm going to draw a line that is 3 centimetres taller than our waistline. Continue that centre back line up to your new casing line, and then repeat that process for the skirt front, drawing a casing in at 3 centimetres higher than the waistband. At this point on the centre front, we also just want to mark where our drawstrings are going to come out, the little holes that they're going to come out of the fabric to tie at the front together. So this is the centre front line here, and we're going to want one hole on either side of the centre front. Now obviously this is only half of the skirt front, so if we just allocate a point maybe 2 centimetres away from the centre front, and 1.5 down from the waistband, that just allocates a nice point here at this point. Mark an X at that point. Now at this point you've done all the pattern drafting that you need to. We're just going to simply use our tracing paper and add our seam allowances as required. If you want to at this point, you can raise the hemline of the garment. I'm just going to raise mine by 15 centimetres just to make it a little bit shorter. You can do whatever you want. Don't forget to add a seam allowance to your hemline if you are altering it. Don't forget, for the purpose of this video, I'm going to be using sharp marker pens, but we would always thoroughly recommend that you use a sharp pencil. We're just using marker pens so you can see them clearly in the video above. Okay, let's start drawing out what we need to for the seam allowances for the skirt back. So to start off with, I'm just going to add our 1.5 centimetre seam allowance down the side. And draw off your hem and the line along the centre back. Now at this point we've got our casing allowance, but we haven't got an allowance to turn under the raw edge of the casing when it hits the inside of the garment. So I'm then going to allow for a 1.5 centimetre offset to the top of the casing. Annotate your pattern piece to add your grain line, which will run perpendicular to your hem. For this particular skirt, it will be cut on the fold along the centre back. Obviously we've got no zip openings or anything else that we need to be concerned about because it was just going to pull up over our hips. Drawstring skirt, cut 1 unfold. The only other thing that I'm going to mark on here actually on the pattern piece is the fold line at the side up here. I'm going to add 2 little notches for where I want to turn the seam under at the top, and also where I want to fold it back under again to create the casing at this point. Once you've done the skirt back, you can just repeat that whole process with the skirt front. Draw in your hemline, whatever that might be. Centre front, there's no seam allowance because that's just going to be placed on the fold. Add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance to the top of your casing and add your 1.5 centimetre seam allowance along your side seam, which is actually the same one as the one I've just drawn there. Next, you want to add your little notches in, and of course your hip line notch as well. And then let's annotate the pattern piece with our grain line and something along the centre front to let us know we need to just place that on the fold. The only other thing on the drawstring front that we want to annotate is going to be where our opening to allow our drawstring to come out through to the front of the skirt will be, which will be right there. For the purpose of this video, we're demonstrating the pattern drafting technique of extending your waist seam allowance up to make it wider, to allow it to incorporate the casing into the pattern piece, the skirt piece or the trouser piece. However, there are a number of different ways that you could create casings. You could use your facing pattern piece to create a casing for your drawstring, and we've shown you how to do that in previous episodes, how to create a facing. And the other thing you could do is just create a separate pattern piece, so like basically like a straight waistband, which again we've shown you how to draft in previous episodes. So you can use a number of different techniques. This one is one that we've not demonstrated before, so I thought it was quite fun to show you how to do this by just extending that waist seam allowance up. So we've got our skirt back and our skirt front sorted. The only thing we've not done now is actually draft out a pattern piece for our drawstring. Now it may well be that you have a drawstring that you want to use yourself, but however, if you don't, let's show you how to draft that out now. In order to draft out our drawstring pattern piece, we just need to take a couple of measurements off our pattern pieces that we've drafted out. So let's go back to those pattern pieces and work out exactly what our measurements are. Obviously yours will be different to mine, so you make a note of yours as you go along. So on the skirt front pattern piece, what I want to know is what is the distance from the centre front to your new side seam at this point. So take that measurement and just make a note of it. For me, that's 25.3. And then just repeat that process for the skirt back. Take a measurement from the side, the new side seam, all the way to the centre back line. For me, that's 27 centimetres. Next, grab your calculator and add your new waist dimension of your skirt back to the new waist dimension of your skirt front. Make a note of that. Next, take a clean piece of paper and draw a line that is as long as your skirt front and skirt back added together. So for me, that is 52.3. Again, use a nice sharp pencil to draw this line out. And then we're just going to add on an extra 20 centimetres to the length of the drawstring, and that will just allow us enough space to be able to tie a nice big bow. Now it may be that when you actually fit your garment, you decide the drawstring is a little bit too long, but it's better to have it too long than too short because that is an easy one to fix. So let's add another 20 centimetres onto the end of our drawstring. Great, so this is the length of our drawstring. However, we now just need to draft out the width that we want our drawstring to be. So our casing width is 3 centimetres wide, so the width of the drawstring needs to fit into that casing. For me, I'm going to draft my drawstring at just 1.5 centimetres wide. However, we mustn't forget that the drawstring is going to be folded back on itself, so the width of our drawstring is going to be double the overall width that you want it to be because it's going to be folded back on itself. For me, I'm choosing to have a 1.5 width drawstring. However, I'm going to double that and take that up to 3 centimetres as I draw a 3 centimetre line parallel to the one that I've just drawn. And just square that off at both ends. So what we've drawn here is one side or one half of our drawstring. We obviously need to cut out 2 to fully encompass the whole of the circumference of our waist. So we're going to draft this out now and we're going to add seam allowances all the way around. This is really simple pattern piece development. We're just going to add a seam allowance all the way around the pattern piece at 1.5 centimetres. These pattern drafting rulers are amazing, aren't they? for just being able to quickly offset your seam allowances. So useful. These pattern drafting rulers are just amazing, aren't they? Just being able to offset your seam allowance beautifully, aren't they? Let's add some annotation to this. The first thing will just be the grain line. It really is as simple as that. So we've done it now. Let's cut out that pattern piece and then cut out those 3 pieces out of your fabric. At this point, we're working with our skirt front pattern piece. The very first thing we need to do to prepare the pattern piece to prepare the fabric for sewing together is to make a note of where this is on the fabric. So this is our point where the opening of our casing is going to be. So we want one on that side, and then you just need to flip the pattern over and mark out where the other one is on the corresponding side. Now this is the right side of the fabric facing up for me at this point. I'm then going to grab a small piece of interfacing and I'm going to interface it over those 2 holes just to reinforce them. However, we're going to do that on the wrong side of the fabric. So grab a piece of interfacing which is the same width as your casing, place it over those 2 points and then just iron that in place. Now, at this point, you've got 2 choices as to how you can create that casing opening. You can either do like a little buttonhole using your sewing machine, and that's what we're going to do today. But you could also choose to use an eyelet instead, because that is a stronger way of reinforcing that opening of your garment. It really is a design preference, and depending on exactly what you're trying to create, whether you're looking for something that has an aesthetic which is a bit more robust and a little bit more sort of I don't know, heavy on detail, that might be one that you want. If you're just creating quite a simple drawstring and it's a very simple garment, the buttonhole detail will be absolutely fine as long as you've reinforced it using interfacing. Now at this point, this is the middle of the hole that we're wanting to create for our drawstring. So you imagine if you've got a button and you could pop that over and just mark on where the top and the bottom is, making sure that the button is right in the middle of that X as you pop it onto the fabric. So we know that we want our 2 buttons to be buttonholes to be that long, and the middle of them is going to be there and there. The reason why I've marked the top and the bottom of those buttonholes is simply because on my sewing machine I've got one of these buttonhole feet, and it starts at one end, it sews back, and then it comes back again. So I just really like to know where the beginning and the end of my stitches need to be. At this point, we're going to create a buttonhole using our sewing machine here in the studio. However, every single sewing machine is different, and depending on which brand you've got, there might be some fine nuances depending on what type of feet you're going to use and the process that you use. So for me, I have a buttonhole foot which I'm going to use. I'm going to insert my small button into the top of it, and off we go on the sewing machine. You make a buttonhole however you need to. So we've now created these 2 little buttonholes, and they're reinforced at the back really nicely too. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is just to open up those buttonholes so there will be space for our drawstring casing to go through. So pop a needle down at one end and then grab your unpicker, pop it through the other end and just gently send it across to that pin. That creates a hold and a nice pin at that point, and it just prevents your unpicker from accidentally slipping all the way through. So just repeat that for the other one as well. Next, we're just going to place the skirt back over the skirt front, line up the edges, pin them in place, and then sew them using our standard 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. Now in this demo we're using contrasting thread as normal, just so you can see it nice and clearly on the video, but obviously you use whatever works best for you and your fabric. At this point I would then recommend just pressing the seams open. Now this is the wrong side of the skirt facing up, and do you remember at the top of the waistband we put 2 little notches? So the first notch here is 1.5 centimetres from the top, and that's the notch at which we just want to turn with wrong sides together and just fold the top of this over by 1.5. Ultimately then we're going to fold it at the next notch as well, which is down here, and then it's going to fold over to create a really nice casing for our drawstring. However, one step at a time. So the first thing we want to do with the wrong sides together is just to fold it over by 1.5 centimeters. So grab your tape measure and a washable pen and just mark off. I'm marking off 3 centimeters because that's where I want my raw edge to then line up with the markings that I've done. That's on the wrong side of the fabric with the wrong side facing up. Once you've marked one side, flip it over and just repeat that process for the back. Now then, just start to roll that over and just pop a few pins in place so that when you go and iron it, you're just making sure that you're definitely getting a nice accurate 1.5 centimeter turn under at that point. Once you've pinned that in place, just go back to the ironing board and iron it in place. The next thing we're going to want to do is to fold it over one more time. We want to fold it along wherever our notch is at that point, so like down like there. However, depending on the width of your casing, you may have a wider or narrower casing width to mine. So for me, remember, we drafted it at 3 centimeters deep. So what I want to do is then flip this over and make sure that it's going to be sitting at 3 centimeters wide. So in order to do that, I'm going to get my tape measure and just mark off points at 6 centimeters, so double the width. It's obviously going to fold down and meet my markers at that point, and flip it over and just put some nice references on the other side too. Once you've done that, you can then just fold it down to meet your markers. This is once again wrong sides together. Now just pop a few pins in place here because we're actually going to flip it over and sew it from the right side in a minute. Make sure that your side seams are lining up really nicely. Now at this point, flip the fabric and turn it round so that it's right side facing out. Now that we've pinned our casing in place nice and neatly with our 3 centimeter offset, so it's folded down 3 centimeters, we now want to sew the casing to the skirt so that it's not flapping around. But we're going to sew it with the right side of the fabric facing up, and that's simply so that we get a nice neat top stitch all the way along here. So your offset from the folded edge is going to be just under 3 centimeters, so 2.7, 2.8 for offset from the folded edge. And that's so that the stitch line is just catching this casing and holding it down to the skirt body. Now don't forget at this point that if you're doing a top stitch, which you will be doing if you're doing your garment for real and it's not just a test, then you want to change your sewing machine to be a top stitch length, and that will be 1.6 mil long. That's looking good, isn't it? So now the only other thing we need to do is just create our drawstring, so let's do that together. The first thing we're going to want to do is just to sew the short end together using our 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. I would then recommend that you just press that seam allowance open. The next thing we want to do is just to fold the raw ends of the short ends of the fabric under by 1.5 centimeters and just iron those in place too. The first thing that I want us to do is just to fold it in half with the wrong sides together. So fold it in half and then just press it all the way along the length of the drawstring. Next, I want us just to open it out and use the line that we've just folded here to fold the long end back in so that it meets that folded edge. And we're just going to press that in place. It's basically like creating bias binding. In fact, for drawstring, you could just use bias binding if you wanted. Repeat that process on both sides of the long edge of the drawstring, so the raw edges are just meeting nicely in the middle. And then finally, we're just going to fold that back onto itself and press that in place. So now both sides of the drawstring are right sides facing together, and the raw edges are nicely encased into the centre of this drawstring. Now then, at this point I would thoroughly recommend just pinning it in place along the drawstring so that everything just stays nice and neatly in place. There are obviously lots of different ways of creating your drawstring. This is just one of them. If you have a preferred method, feel free to use it. Great, so now that we have ironed that in place and prepped it all, we're now just going to sew it in place. Don't forget that we are top stitching this element of the drawstring, so change your sewing machine to have the correct length stitch for your top stitch, which is around 1.6 mil. Okay, lovely. So we've got our drawstring now, and I'm just going to pop a safety pin through one end of our newly created drawstring, and I'm just going to push it through one end of our skirt. Now the lovely thing about designing and creating your own skirts is that you can tailor this to be exactly how you want it. You may think, oh, this is a little bit thick, and you might want a casing that is a little bit more delicate and a bit thinner, and that's absolutely fine. That's the whole point of just exploring making your own patterns and making your own adaptations to this skirt block. So I hope that you're finding it helpful just to see one way, and then you're thinking creatively about how you might change and adapt and use this technique to do something that you really want to create, or that suits the fabric choice that you've got, or the Pinterest image board that you've got. That's the whole reason why we've done this series in little bits, just showing you little techniques for different aspects so that you can then sort of like jigsaw them all together and decide which one you want to do. And when you hit the other side, you can just bring that drawstring back through the other buttonhole. Oh, that looks really cute. I quite like the navy and the cream. It looks all right, doesn't it? Perfect. So now it's time to try that on. And this is our drawstring waistband done and complete. You can see that it's quite a relaxed finish, isn't it? But it looks really cute with the little bow at the front. Really like that feature. It's just gathered really nicely, naturally, all the way around the waistband so that you can loosen it or tighten it as you want throughout the day, which is always an excellent feature to any pattern. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you've really enjoyed the whole process of learning about how to create a drawstring waistband. As we said at the beginning, this is such a versatile little technique that you can add to trousers or skirts, and even dresses if you put a casing inside the waist of a dress. So a really interesting and useful little technique. As ever, we've got loads of these pattern drafting videos for you to take a look at, for you to pick and mix the combinations of different techniques that you want to do for your own body block. As ever, we love to hear from our maker community here at Minerva. So please do create a free account on our website so that you can join in the conversation, upload your photos of your makes, and be inspired by the rest of the sewing community. Please do upload your photos of any experiments you've done with your skirt block, adding waistbands, doing hems, altering, adding flare and volume, whatever you've been doing. We would love to hear from you and love to see what you're creating. And if you have any comments or questions about this particular video, feel free just to pop them below the video and we will respond shortly. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next time.